So thank you. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Yes, okay. You can come forward. I was mentioning to Valeria before, there's actually good data that sitting in the front means you learn more, retain more, and just in case you think there's a selection bias in this, it turns out randomized people moving to the front do better on exams than if you sit in the back. There's not going to be an exam on this, but anyway, just in case. All right, so I want to thank Richard Bellamy for inviting me to give a Max Weber lecture. I want to thank Francesca Grassini for all her help with the logistics. Jared and Richard for interviewing me, Valeria for filming me, and everybody for making me feel very welcome. I'm afraid there is no real connection to the lecture's namesake. I tried to think of one, perhaps in a very general sense. I'm going to be thinking about the role of ideas and their influence on economic models, but Weber would have really disapproved of most of what I'm going to say, and the people that I take inspiration from, he would have despised. So much for the Max Weber part of the Max Weber lecture, but I am honored to be here. So I want to start with a quote from Tawney. So I'm taking a lot of my inspiration today from the British ethical socialists, the kind of designers of the British welfare state. So I'll just read this quote, and it'll be the beginning of the lecture and the end of the lecture, so it'll be sort of framing the lecture. So Tawney says, "What's repulsive is not that one man should earn more than others, for where the community of environment and a common education and habit of life have bred a common tradition of respect and consideration, these details of the counting house are forgotten or ignored. It is that some classes should be excluded from the heritage of civilization which others enjoy, and that the fact of human fellowship, which is ultimate and profound, should be obscured by economic contrasts, which are trivial and superficial. What is important is not that all men should receive the same pecuniary income. It is that the surplus resources of society should be so husbanded and applied that it is a matter of minor significance whether they receive it or not." And that's the idea I want to explore, this idea that there are resources of society that can be husbanded or directed in such a way that the inequalities in income and wealth that remain, and again, doesn't mean any income inequality, but within bounds, can be contained in such a way that they're of little importance. That's the idea I want to explore. And you'll see, of course, this connects to the theme of in-kind goods that I'm going to be talking about. So to begin, James Tobin, Nobel laureate in economics, wrote a wonderful paper in 1970 on the domain. The paper is called Limiting the Domain of Inequality, where he draws a contrast between two types of egalitarian. The general egalitarian, who he says is concerned with equality in income and wealth, and the specific egalitarian who is concerned not so much with equality in the domain of income and wealth, but in specific realms like healthcare or education. And what is striking is that if you think about state distribution and redistribution, most of the modern state actually distributes its resources or redistributes resources in the form of in-kind goods. Roughly 50% of distribution in the United States, and the United States lags behind Europe in this, is distributed in the form of in-kind goods, not in the form of redistributive taxation. And those include, here are some of the major ones: education, of course, disability accommodation, job training, Medicaid, public housing, food stamps, and the like. So the government distributes in kind, but if you read egalitarian writing of the kind of modern period, much of the focus is not on in-kind goods, but on income and wealth inequality. And Tobin notes that while the concerned laymen who observe people with shabby housing or too little to eat instinctively want to provide them with decent housing and adequate food, economists instinctively want to provide them with more cash income. Then they can buy the housing and food if they want to, and if they choose not to, the presumption is that they have better use for the money. So this is a kind of a general orientation, and not only of economists, but of many egalitarian philosophers. And there are really two objections that have been leveled against in-kind good distribution. The first is an efficiency objection, and the second is that in-kind distribution is objectionably paternalist. And so I'm going to spend the first part of my lecture looking at those two objections and trying to argue that those two objections can be defeated in many circumstances, so that in-kind distribution, first of all, can be efficient, and it can be more efficient than cash distribution in various contexts. And second, that the basis of substantial amounts of in-kind distribution can rest on other grounds that avoid the charge of paternalism. And so I'm going to spend some time arguing against these two objections to clear the ground for in-kind distribution. And then I'm going to draw on the ethical socialists to argue that there's a special role that in-kind good distribution can play in some cases, that it can make possible a kind of egalitarian relationship between people that can't be achieved by other means, in particular can't be achieved simply by relying on cash. Now, before I make these arguments, I just want to note, for the purposes of fair treatment of my opponents, that most of the critics of in-kind distribution do make two exceptions to their arguments against in-kind distribution. So they tend to exempt political goods, like votes, and pure public goods. Pure public goods are goods, let me start with votes, with political goods. So take votes. So votes are given to citizens, right? Even though there's some citizens who would rather have cash rather than their vote. Probably a lot of citizens, unfortunately, would rather have cash than their vote. And many citizens would want to trade their vote. But societies give votes in kind, and they prevent people from trading that vote. Now, Tobin says any first-year economics student could show that a market in votes would be Pareto optimal. I actually think he's wrong on this, because I think there are third-party effects of a market in votes. But even if he were right, even if it was more efficient to have a market in votes, most of us would think there's something wrong with allowing people to use these as fungible goods. National defense is an example of a pure public good, which is often, again, an exception to the argument against in-kind provision. Pure public goods are what economists will call non-excludable and non-rivalrous, meaning they have to be provided to everybody and at the same level. And so there's no way to exclude people. And so if I don't want to contribute for a public good like defense, I'll ride free on your contribution, and so nobody will contribute, and so the state has to come in and provide in-kind national defense. But aside from political goods, a narrow class of political goods, and the pure public goods. As I said, most economists, in fact, almost all economists, and many political philosophers are committed to the superiority of cash transfers over in-kind transfers. So you could think about Ronald Dworkin in his very influential theory of equality, equality of resources, argues for dividing resources equally as fungible in his model, clamshells, but you can think of cash. And the reason is not only the practical one where he says you can't divide all the things in the world up equally for everybody, because there's some things that are too scarce, so not everybody could get a share. But he says it's, from an egalitarian point of view, it would be unfair to give people certain kinds of goods, like education, let's say adults, because some people have less use for those than others. They are less valuable to them, and if you don't allow them to trade them, you're basically privileging some people's conception of the good over other people's conception, and that's illegitimate from an egalitarian point of view. Since Philippe von Parijs is here, I have to mention in his earlier work, although less in his later work, he argues that in-kind provision of health care can be justified on two grounds. One is externalities, so the case of, like, you should provide people with vaccines. And the other is if we think a reasonable person would have insured against a certain kind of risk that they voluntarily, that they have to undertake. Now, of course, he would allow substantial baseline transfer of income, but this amount of provision of health care falls far short of what most modern democratic societies give in kind as an entitlement. And on the right, on the political right, Milton Friedman and Charles Murray argue that we should replace all in-kind distribution by the state with a check that would be issued to every person in the United States, which they could use to do whatever they want. And they make this argument not only on efficiency grounds, but on anti-paternalistic grounds, that it's objectionably paternalist. So this belief in the more or less universal superiority of providing people with cash over in-kind goods can be contrasted with an earlier tradition of thought, of egalitarian thought. And according to that tradition, the provision of some goods in kind is so fundamental to our equal standing as citizens that these goods should be treated the same way as we treat national defense, even in the absence of market failure. So Musgrave called these merit goods, and he said that merit goods should be supplied not in terms of people's preferences, but in terms of other kinds of social objectives. And as ethical socialists like Tawney and Cole, G.D.H. Cole, T.H. Marshall, William Morris, all thought these goods had a very special role to play in allowing a society of equals. And they had in mind for these in-kind goods, goods like National Health Service, guaranteed jobs, protection against market vulnerability, free public education, but you could extend their argument to other goods like childcare and elder care, opportunity for political influence, and even broadband internet access and free time. So my aim in today's talk is to make this case for in-kind good provision more attractive to contemporary egalitarianism. Okay, so that's preamble. Now to efficiency. Okay, so the efficiency objection is pretty straightforward, and if I can do this. Okay, so this is from Schelling. Schelling also talks about how people always go to the back of the room. There's an actually nice essay he has on why students sit in the back of the room, but that's an aside. Okay, so Schelling says, my students always like gas rationing. So think of gas rationing as an in-kind distribution. You give everybody access to gas, right, to coupons, which they can use to purchase gas. So the first step in subverting their ethical preference is to propose that under any system of rationing they devise, people should be encouraged to buy and sell their ration coupons. So if I have a coupon and I don't need it that much, and you have a coupon, but you need more gas than your coupon, here's an efficiency, let's trade, I'll take some cash and I'll give you my coupon, which I don't need, maybe I don't drive. This proposal has little appeal to its students, right? The rich will obviously burn more than their share of gas, the poor being coerced by their poverty into releasing coupons for the money they desperately need. But eventually, my students recognize that the poor, because they are poor, would like the privilege of turning their coupons into money. Whereas gas coupons can only provide them gas at a discount, transferable coupons can buy milk at a discount. If it's unfair that the poor cannot drive as much as the rich, it's the poverty that is unfair, not the gasoline system. The principle established, we observe that the coupons are worth cash, whether you buy them, sell them, or merely turn in your own at the local service station. We could just as well have done without the coupons. So what Schelling is saying is, look, it's inefficient, right, to distribute gasoline in kind to people because you're constricting people's preferences, including the preferences here of the poor. And if you are objecting to the situation of the poor, then the right response to that is to look at the underlying distribution of resources and give the poor more cash with which then they can decide what they want to spend the cash on. So this is a very straightforward efficiency, justification, efficiency, and then adding an egalitarian case that tells you that cash distribution is superior to in-kind distribution. Does everybody follow this so far? Okay, so it's a familiar idea, right? And the familiar idea is that if there are no externalities and if people are well informed, then allowing them to trade, right, will generate an equilibrium outcome that is what economists will call Pareto optimal, where you can't make any further trades without somebody being worse off. So it's efficient if those conditions are met. So the first thing to notice is the if those conditions are met, right? The optimality property only follows if it's the case that people are well informed and there are no externalities. So we can immediately think of the ways that market imperfections limit the case for the superiority of cash that Schelling gives, and Schelling himself, I think, would have to admit this, right? So you can imagine a bunch of conditions. So targeting. Supposing it's the case that you want to offer cash, but you don't know who to offer the cash to. Well, supposing it's cash in order to help people with their housing costs. If it's cash, everybody has an interest in saying that they're a worthy recipient of cash, so the government then has to screen people, which is expensive. If you offer housing to people, and particularly housing of a certain kind, quality and quantity, there's going to be less dissembling or less there'll be less need for screening. So targeting, when the government lacks information, sometimes can be solved using in-kind distribution. The second reason that in-kind distribution can sometimes be efficient is that within the household, there are power relations within the household, and sometimes you want to make sure that the thing you're supplying gets to the most vulnerable. So you can think about, school lunches or even food stamps as ways of making sure, right, that children get a certain kind of good provided that perhaps wouldn't be provided in other ways. You can think about things like childcare and elder care as help, making sure that women have access to employment, Whereas if you want to get women into the workforce, giving them in-kind provision in the form of childcare might have a different effect than just giving them cash, where they might stay home. Now again, we'll get to the paternalist objection, but here I'm just talking about the efficiency objection. And finally, there can be actually not finally, I have one more. There can be coordination problems. So sometimes it's the case that there are collective action problems. We saw that already with the case of national defense, but there are other kinds of goods. So take healthcare. Healthcare is a kind of good where if you allow people to select in and select out at will into a healthcare market, there's what economists call adverse selection, right? So if you're healthy, you'll tend not to want to buy the insurance if you know how healthy you are. If that's the case, the people who are healthy stand out of the market, and the market therefore becomes more expensive for those who are left in. That can continue, and the healthcare system can begin to unravel. And the best way to address that is to actually make the healthcare mandatory for everybody. But even when there aren't market failures, so these are all cases of a market failure, but even when there are no market failures, it can be the case that in-kind goods are efficient. And so this is just a little technical, like a blip here, but when there are interdependent preferences or interdependent utility functions, so if I, the donor, get utility from your consumption of an in-kind good like education, as opposed to your consumption of, I don't know, loud music, then it can be Pareto optimal, right, for the in-kind good to be provided, right? So, and Tobin notes this, right? Tobin says, if people have a preference for equality in the domain of certain kinds of goods, like I care a lot about redressing inequality in education, then it can be the case, right, that it's actually efficient because of my preferences over your preferences to provide the good in kind, to minimize the scope of inequality. So that's just to say where there are interdependent preferences, there's reason to think in-kind good provision can be efficient. Okay, but that just now pushes us to the second objection. So all I've done so far is say, look, it's just not the case that cash is always more, distributing cash is always more efficient than distributing in-kind. But even so, there's a paternalist argument against in-kind distribution. Many people, maybe most people, object to in-kind distribution, not because it's inefficient, but because they think the government or some other party is substituting their judgment about what's best for the recipient's judgment. So in the gasoline case that Schelling mentions, it looks like you, the donor, are basically saying to the poor, this is what you should want, but the poor may not want that. And in particular, that's seen as delivering to the poor or to the recipient a particular kind of insult, right? I mean, there are cases where we think paternalism is justified. I'm going to skip that. So if you're dealing with children, if you're dealing maybe where preferences are unstable, sometimes people think nudging is acceptable, some people think it's not acceptable, it's still paternalist, but you might think there's some conditions under which paternalism is justified, but in most of the cases of in-kind provision, that doesn't obtain. Right, so when we're giving food stamps or delivering housing vouchers or a guaranteed job, we're basically saying to people, look, this is what you should, this looks like we're saying this is what you should have whether or not you want it. And in fact, there has been a paternalist underpinning to a lot of in-kind good provision, right? So if you look at the history of, aid to the poor, it's rife with views of the poor as incompetent, as, sort of, they can't be trusted. That's certainly something people deal with when they're dealing with arguments about universal basic income. The poor are just going to dissipate it. They're not going to spend it on things that are valuable to them. So it's undeniable. And notice, that's not just about in-kind provision. There's just a general suspicion of the poor, whatever form of distribution you give to the poor. But at least, if you do in-kind, you're limiting it even more. And there's no question, as I said, that that's true of a lot of in-kind distribution. Behind it are views about the poor not being competent. But I want to note that it's not a necessary a part of in-kind distribution to have that attitude. So, for example, in the United States, one of the biggest in-kind provision deliveries was the GI Bill. So the GI Bill gave to returning soldiers from World War II vouchers that they could use for education. It was not stigmatized. There was no view that the GIs were incompetent behind it. So it's not necessary that in-kind distribution be humiliating or suspicious. Nonetheless, you might object to the GI provision. You might say, look, that some GIs might have had better use, for resources beyond going to school. Maybe that wasn't the best resource for them. Who was, the government to step in? So I want to ask, is it the case that always, when you narrow, right, the class, with the exception of the market failures I looked at, that you're always acting paternalistically when you deliver in kind? And so let me give you an argument against that view. So this will be I'll now answer the paternalist objection, I hope, and then I'm going to, in the third part, talk about the particular egalitarian view of the importance of in-kind provision. But the way of answering the paternalist objection is to notice that we're entering the argument at a late stage. So when we're asking, is it paternalist to deliver aid in kind as opposed to cash, we've already decided that we're going to be transferring resources, and now we're thinking, what's the right form this should take? But actually, we have to step back and ask the first question, which is, why are we obligated in the first place to transfer resources, right? Why is it that the government should distribute or redistribute in any form, resources from one person to another? What kind of justification is there? And of course, the usual answer a political philosopher will give is that there are grounds of justice for distribution. But once we say there are grounds of justice, well, then we can ask, well, what are the grounds of justice? Or what am I obligated to provide on grounds of justice? And it's then open, there are different theories about that. So if I'm a utilitarian, I'll say, I'm justified, the ground of justice is I should transfer resources to maximize utility. And whatever form of distribution maximizes utility, that's the form of distribution I should undertake. That's one possible justification. But of course, there's another justification. Let's see, I think I have another slide. Okay, I might be a rights theorist. So I might think, as a matter of right, people are entitled, right, to certain things. And the ground of justice is their entitlement. But if I think that, I might think that their entitlement is to particular things, right? Their entitlement might be to education. I mean, different theories of rights will fill out this idea in different ways. What's the level of education? Maybe I'm entitled to housing, to food, to basic rights, to basic freedoms. So I'll fill it out. But on that view, it may be that it's not open to me to ask the question, should this be cash or not? Because if I'm committed to this theory of justice, I've already decided that there are some entitlements people have. So imagine I think you have an entitlement to food and housing. And now imagine that Richard, so I'll invoke an example of Tim Scanlon here. So imagine Richard isn't interested in food or housing. He wants to spend the money on building a monument to his God. Okay, so that's his use. But now what if he does that? I mean, the ground of my obligation wasn't what he wants, right? It was some view about what he needs or what he's entitled to as a human being. So if he spends that on the monument to his God, he's bled away the justification that I had in the first place for transferring those resources. The reason I owed something to him was I owed it to him to be fed and clothed and, and so on. I didn't owe it to him to give him money to build a monument to his God. So if that's the case, right, then there's an answer to the person who says, but wait, you're substituting your judgment for his. I'm not substituting my judgment for his. I'm acting on the grounds of, it's nothing to do with him. It has to do with what's the basis of my obligation, or what's the basis of the state's obligation in justice to do certain things. And if that's the argument, as I said, then it's not a paternalist argument. It's not an argument about substituting one person's judgment for another. It's an obligation that flows from what the nature of justice is. Now, I could be wrong about justice. We could argue about that. But if you think that justice requires providing people with certain entitlement, with certain kinds of goods, like housing and making sure they're fed and clothed and nourished and educated, then that's what your obligation is to provide them with. Okay. So that's a non-paternalist argument in favor of in-kind goods. So maybe I've convinced you of that. But now, assuming I've convinced you that there is a non-paternalist argument in favor of in-kind goods, I now want to look at a particular version of that, and that's, social democratic, ethical socialist view that not only do we have obligations to provide people with in-kind goods, but there's some in-kind goods that have a character that we have to provide them equally to everybody, and that vouchers, we can't even use vouchers as in so that the move that Schelling was making from in-kind to vouchers to cash, we can't even make the first step. We can't go from in-kind to vouchers. That's what I'm going to try to show you. So, okay. Everybody following? Yes, kind of? All right. Let me know if there's some. Okay. So I'm going to give you two cases to try to make this argument. And the first case, I'm going to draw on an example of Brian Barry's about education. So here are two ways you could distribute education. You could allocate children to public schools in such a way that those public schools are representative of the ethnic and class mix of the area that the kids are. And let's assume we can also, through zoning, make sure that the neighborhoods are integrated by race and class. But we could also distribute kids to schooling in a second way, and this is something Milton Friedman proposed. We can give every parent a voucher and let them use the voucher, right, to pick the school that they want to send their kids in. And we could even be egalitarian, right? We can play with the amount of the voucher. Like some people think we can weight the voucher in various ways. So it's very complicated to look at these two models, and a A lot of people have liked the voucher model because they think it engenders competition between schools that can improve school quality. And then, of course, parents will move their kids to the schools that seem the best. But I think Barry is right to favor option 1 over option 2, and that points us in a kind of collectivist, socialist direction. And that's because when you empower parents as individual decision makers, they'll do what parents ought to do, which is they'll try to find the best option for their kids. And what happens when they do that, not totally surprisingly, at least in the United States, where this is more of a US-centric example, is that we find that voucher systems, schools are more segregated by race and class than the ordinary public school. And why is that? Because parents are trying to do the best for their kids. Of course, education is a really hard good to evaluate, so there is a weak agency. We really, people are really bad at telling how good education is. It's also, I think Joe Wolf calls it a slow release good, because it takes years sometimes to figure out, was this teacher really any good? And so what the parents do is they use class primarily, but class and race as markers of school quality. Now, maybe that makes the parents happy, but the parents as parents, but when they think of themselves as citizens, they have a lot of reason to object to a school system that's segregated by race and class. Right? Not only does it lead to social instability, but there are all kinds of downstream effects of that kind of segregation. But the problem is parents, empowered as individual decision makers, have no ability to bring about a just, an integrated school system. They can only bring that about by acting in common together, right? So even a voucher system that constrains the amount that parents can put to schools, they have to use them for schools, can't deliver the same thing as the in-kind distribution. Okay, I see that I'm taking too long. Okay. My second example is the disabled and accommodation to the disabled. So it's pretty expensive. So in the United States, we have a lot of legislation which argues that classrooms and workplaces and public spaces have to accommodate the disabled. It would be a lot cheaper if we just issued a check to every person who's disabled, and with the money that they got in the check, they could do things like hire somebody to pick them up and carry them over steps. They could hire somebody to shop for them in the narrow supermarket aisles. They could work from home, okay? So you could compensate for some of the disadvantages that the disabled suffer. But what you couldn't do, and this is similar to the schooling case, is integrate them as equals into society. And if you think of the disabled as a marginalized caste, giving them cash, even a lot of cash, doesn't overcome that segregation or marginalization. It's true, it could help. I'm not arguing against giving people cash, but I'm just saying it's not sufficient. It can't achieve the goal of integrating them as equals in the same way that an education system designed on a voucher plan doesn't deliver the same good of integrating students as equals. Okay. So I think these are important cases, the case of disability and the case of schooling, because they don't involve market failures, at least in the classical case. They involve cases where we have reason, maybe on grounds of justice, to want certain goods delivered to people, right, that a cash alone can't provide. So I want to now turn, though, to the social democratic footnote on this, which is not only is there an argument for providing in-kind goods to achieve some important goals for an egalitarian, but that these in-kind goods should be delivered equally. And so I want to give, because notice, if I have a rights-based theory, supposing I think you have, Richard has that right to housing and food, even if he would prefer to worship his God, but, that sets a baseline or a floor. It doesn't say you can't buy up and, maybe my housing could be a lot better than his. So I want to look at the argument that the ethical socialists made that some goods should be given in kind to people equally. And that will get us back to the Tawney quote, which I began the lecture with. Okay, so they have, I think, where am I? Let's see. Oh, well, there's just my inspiration. There's Tawney and Marshall, and this is not a society of equals. This is what they want to overcome. And so they're going to make, okay, that was that. All right, okay. Oh, I'm not up to the objections. Okay, so they have several reasons for thinking some goods should be delivered to everybody in the same way. And the first is a psychological argument. That is, they thought it was really important in a democratic society that people have common experiences, and that social solidarity was very important to maintaining these sorts of societies. And in order to recognize other people as equally deserving as you had to, in some sense, see yourself as in the same boat as they were, or they are. And if you live lives that are totally disconnected from other people, you can't identify as being in the same boat. So here's a quote of Tawney about the British school system and their private, which I guess is, their system of what are called public schools, but we would in the United States call private schools. So Tawney says, "It is once an educational monstrosity and a grave national misfortune. It's educationally vicious, since to mix with companions from homes of different types is an important part of the education of the young. It's socially disastrous, for it does more than any cause except capitalism itself to perpetuate the division of the nation into classes of which one is unintelligible to the other." So they had this view that unless there were spaces of common experience, you would have a class society, right? People wouldn't care about each other, they wouldn't identify with each other, they wouldn't see each other as in the same boat, and they could discount one another. And that leads to the second reason they gave for giving equal in-kind goods, which is they thought in some cases, when you allow inequalities, it's actually bad for the worst off. So it's not just that there's inequality, it's that you make those on the bottom worse off. And I'll give you an analogy to how this might work. So when seatbelts were first introduced in the United States, they were only introduced for the car driver, right? That was so the car driver had to wear a seatbelt, nobody else. And to the surprise of lawmakers, who are very bad at predicting things, the result of this was an increase in the number of fatalities on the road. So why was that? Because the drivers felt safer, so they took more risks, and those risks fell on the more vulnerable people. And the solution here was to put people in the same position, right? So some people have argued that if you allow, for example, legislators to exempt their children from the public schools, to get private solutions, those decision makers will then not care about the costs that are imposed on other people, and those other people who are vulnerable will be even worse off. So that was another thing that the these moral economists or ethical socialists worried about. And the third reason that they thought some goods should be given equally was they also thought, and this will again resonate with the Tawney quote, when money is unequal, those with more money can win out in a competition over those with less money. So the only way to prevent a world in which the richer, even if people are more equal, some will always have more money than others, the only way to protect the people with less is to take some things out of that competition so that the poor don't lose out in those competitions, because those things they have equal access to they get just as good as everyone else, even though they have less money. And you can think about like debates about kidney markets, or organ markets are partly about, in the pure form of the market, the poor lose out on so many things. Like now you're gonna, take body parts and distribute them according to ability to pay. There needs to be some spaces in society where the people who have less don't lose. So that was another reason. Okay, so now 2 criticisms of this view so far, and then I'll wrap up. So the first is this really a good egalitarian strategy? Right, so the strategy is provide a lot of in-kind goods, some equally to other people, right? And then, direct less attention on income and wealth inequality. It's not direct no attention to income and wealth inequality, but put the focus on marshaling society's resources for these public goods. So one thing you could say is, but really, as long as there is wealth inequality, you're never going to have a society of equals, right? Campaign, like as long as the rich have more money, as long as some people they're going to always use the money to buy advantage. So this idea that you could insulate, from the effects of unequal wealth, it's just utopian. And, in fact, Julian Legrand, in evaluating in the early 1980s, the National Health Service said that, studied it and said, look, the rich make more use of the National Health Service than the poor do. And it would be a lot better, he argued, to just abolish the National Health Service and give the poor big checks, which then they could use to find health care. Now, I do think it's an open question how far this strategy can succeed. We don't have a lot, we have some evidence, but we still don't have a lot of evidence. And it certainly is true that we have to, pay attention to this. If you look at Legrand's own study, it actually turns out that a lot of the reason the poor didn't use the National Health Service as much as the rich is because they lacked access to other in-kind goods. Like one big reason is what he found was transportation costs. They couldn't get to the National Health Service. But of course, if you provided other goods to them in kind, or provided income, a certain floor of income, they might have been able to access the NHS. So I think it's I'll say partly an open question as to whether or not, when you're thinking about alternative strategies, how much equality you can get through this strategy of narrowing the scope of the market and taking some goods out of the market and providing them equally to all versus redistributing cash. But at the very least, the cases of education and disability show that distributing cash is not sufficient for realizing a society of equals. Okay, so that's the first point. And this just shows you like educational outcomes track inequality. So this is making the case, if you really want to deal with educational outcomes, you should transfer cash, because they seem to work lockstep. Okay, and the second objection is, okay, if you're an unsympathetic critic of mine, you might say, look, you wanted to provide, said you should provide Richard with housing and health care and food, not the, monument to his God, but, supposing he doesn't take up the goods you supply, shouldn't you force him to take them up? I mean, it's one thing, like, I'm talking about giving him access. Supposing, he wants to live in the street. Should I drag him in and, force him to eat his vegetables when he doesn't want to? And I should say, as I was, thinking about all of this, the President of the United States just announced that he thinks food stamps are too unrestrictive and that he wants food stamps to be limited to canned goods delivered to the poor in boxes so that they have no choice over what they eat, but that they'll get the specific, like, it's not just enough to give people vouchers, you should force them to eat spinach. Okay, so that seems like a reductio, maybe, of this view. So my view is that the degree of freedom that people need with respect to these in-kind goods is context-specific. Sometimes the right thing to do is to give people vouchers and let them choose for themselves how they want to utilize within a domain, let's say within food or within housing, where they want to live, what kind of food they want to eat. In other cases, like education and disability, the vouchers are insufficient, and you actually have to deliver the in-kind good. It's also true that the fact that one person or a few people don't take up a good doesn't undermine the overall system of justice. So if the system of justice is to provide certain goods to people and some people don't take them up, okay, that's a cost, those people don't take them up. But sometimes people not taking up certain goods can actually undermine the overall system of justice. And then it might be a case that we are justified in forcing people to take up certain goods. Now, like I was talking about the ethical socialist, now I sound like a Stalinist. But, think about the fact that less than 50% of the population votes in the United States. That actually has a consequence to the legitimacy of the democracy. And so you might, again, you might not want to imprison people for not voting, but you might do things like they do in some countries of fining people for not voting because you think the taking up of the good, of a particular good, is really important to the stability, the overall stability and legitimacy of the system. But I will not defend that in depth here, just to make the point that it's context-specific. How much freedom you can allow with respect to the good depends on, right, what the requirements of justice are. Okay, to conclude. So today, as many commentators have noted, public things are in disrepair. Right? Not a lot of attention these days to public things. In fact, particularly in the country I come from, our shared roads are crumbling, infrastructure's going away, social segregation's on the rise. The welfare state in the United States, but also in Europe, is under attack, and lots of its functions are being outsourced or privatized. So it's not surprising in that context that reformers look to other strategies to either minimize the role of the state or to try to bypass the state when possible. And it's possible that some of these more minimalist strategies or these bypassing strategies could make some inroads on poverty and could make some inroads with respect to equality. But if I'm right about the importance of in-kind goods to the egalitarian project, then there are limits to strategies like universal basic income or negative income tax. Again, this isn't an argument that these things don't have a place, but their place isn't as prominent as I think is sometimes thought. And I've given 4 reasons why the state providing money to individuals is not the same thing as the state giving people specific goods. First, sometimes there are efficiency reasons to prefer giving in-kind goods. Sometimes in-kind goods are actually more efficient. Second, and most importantly, there's some social ends, like integration, which can't be easily brought about by individuals acting on their own, but require collective action of us acting in concert together. Third, there are requirements of justice, at least, and according to many theories of justice, giving money alone doesn't discharge our obligations of justice. We have obligations to provide particular goods to people. And fourth, there are psychological, relational, and compensatory benefits of giving some goods in kind to people equally, as opposed to simply giving them money. So this argument is not paternalist, and it brings us closer to the ideal of social justice that inspired the founders of the modern welfare state. They saw the modern welfare state not as a provider of handouts or a wise paternalist intervener. Instead, they saw in the goods that the welfare state would provide free health care, free schooling, public housing, full employment, job training, the delivery of a society in which its citizens can relate to each other as free and equal members. These thinkers would be surprised by the eclipse of in-kind goods in contemporary egalitarian thinking. And I'll end on that. Thank you.